This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 95 of Here's How for the 30th of October 2019. In this podcast, we talk to the founder of a news website who claims that he wants to give voice to views that are not represented in the mainstream media. But what does he want to use that voice to say?
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up in a few minutes.
So we have backers. We're unashamed about this and open about this, that the Life Institute, which is a pro-life charity and campaigning organisation.
Many people would associate that, particularly given the personnel involved with youth defence.
Yeah, it's true, but it's a bit like saying you'd associate the Labour Party with the old IRA.
That's coming up in a moment. In fact, it's coming up very, very soon because I do have some editorial comments, but I'm putting them after the interview for reasons that will become evident. On the line now, I have John McGuirk. He was a prominent and articulate, though ultimately unsuccessful campaigner against the abortion referendum in 2018. He's a regular columnist with the Irish Catholic newspaper, and just this year he launched Gript, an Irish news and comment website. John, what is Gript for?
Gript, I guess, is an attempt to create space in the Irish media that doesn't already exist. That space, to my mind, exists on the centre right of where the Irish media currently is. And to not so much, people use phrases like breaking the consensus or, challenging the establishment, or all the rest of it. But what I wanted to kind of do, what we wanted to do, it wasn't just me, was to create an environment where conversations that are already happening up and down the country can be reflected in a way that they're not currently being reflected in the rest of the media. There are a whole range of issues where that might be an example, but I suppose the two most prominent ones, the ones that jump immediately to mind, are the issues of immigration and climate change, where I would say that we live in a country where there is a progressive consensus on those issues in the media and in the political classes. I don't think that's unfair to say.
Pause on that for a second. Are you sure about that? Because I know, you come from what might be called the pro-life movement. You have been allied with, not necessarily formally, but you're on the same side of the argument as people like David Quinn, Breda O'Brien, who regularly, from their newspaper columns, from their own writing in their own newspaper in the Irish Catholic and so forth, from their frequent TV and radio appearances, say how they're being censored and not allowed to contribute to the conversation. We can almost not get away from that.
Well, I think there's two things to say here. The first thing you have to do is recognize that there is a fundamental difference between news and opinion. And there is no doubt that David and Breda and the people that you've mentioned, to which you could also add over the years, people like Kevin Myers, for example, etc., have been very prominent commentators. There's no shortage of centre-right commentary. What I think there is an absence of, though, is I always say that when people say there's a progressive bias in the media, that is not necessarily true in the sense of how stories are written. And I've argued with journalists about this over the years.
You're saying there is not a progressive bias in the way stories are written?
In the way stories are written. And that's the emphasis on the way stories are written, because, any journalist worth their salt can can go down to a protest, write up one side said this, the other side said that, this is what happened, piece. Where there is, I think, a selective bias in the media is how stories are selected. So it's what we're talking about to begin with. So, for example,
I actually totally agree with you on that. I'm going to pause on that because I'm going to go to a couple of other things, but I want to get some details out of the way. We'll definitely come back to that, but I actually completely agree with you that selection is very important, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. But just very briefly first, what's the budget? Who's funding Gript?
The budget is tiny. I mean, the startup costs for the website, you will know and appreciate that
you don't have advertising. There's no paywall. There's no apparent means of support.
The objective is to get to a point where advertising becomes viable. That is the objective. You can't run advertising on day one, because who's going to pay to advertise to 10 people who log on the first day? So the objective is to ultimately build an audience to get to advertising. In the interim, we are reliant on two things: people writing for peanuts or nothing at all, and on the one hand, and also on the second hand, people being willing to click the donate button on our site and run it at a loss, essentially, for the first while. Similar to what, I mean, if you look at the journal.ie, which has been hugely successful, and I guess to some extent is the inspiration for the business model we ultimately want to pursue. I remember talking to people in the journal before it was launched, and I remember watching it be launched, and it ran on thin air for a while. So we have backers. We're unashamed about this and open about this, that the Life Institute, which is a pro-life charity and campaigning organization,
many people would associate that, particularly given the personnel involved, with youth defence.
It's not youth defence. It is true.
But many of the individuals, there's a large crossover in the membership.
Yeah, it's true, but it's a bit like saying you'd associate the Labour Party with the old IRA, because some of its members used to be members of the Workers' Party, which evolved from the old IRA. But that is true. It does come from that background. There is an evolution. People's views don't stay the same. People's tactics don't stay the same. They evolve. But anyway, the question you asked me was about funding, and and that is where the predominant seed capital for developing the website, developing the platform and everything came from. And then obviously we are actively, as you can see, if you look at any story on the website, much like The Guardian does, asking for donations. There are a few individuals around the country. There's one individual down in Cork who contributes a couple of £100 a month in a direct debit. There are others who contribute smaller amounts. We are not running even at break even at this point in time, which is why, as I say, hardly anyone working for the platform is in receipt of any.
Welcome to the internet.
Exactly.
Roughly how many articles a day do you publish?
The target is 2 or 3. I mean, obviously, if you look at, and I use the example of the journal, they're at 20 or 30, but then they have 40 or 50 full-time staff and a huge operation. We don't. So the target is 2 or 3 plus one piece of video content.
Okay. And then I just want to move on to, in terms of philosophy, are you essentially saying that you'll throw up anything that will support your cause, or do you have a high-minded objective in terms of truth and reliability? Are you looking to get people to say, that must be true, I read it on Gript?
don't think anyone should ever say that must be true, I read it anywhere. Nevertheless,
different news outlets have different levels of trust and care to a different degree about their level of trust.
No, I absolutely get the point. And what we're trying to do, ultimately, we want the highest possible level of trust. And what we want to do, my aim, ultimately, is to get to a point where people who disagree with us would be able to say, we think they are wrong, but they are honestly wrong.
Okay. That's an answer to that question. Let me have a look, because when we were discussing this, I was interested in that one story in particular that I sent to you, and I think it was written by you yourself, and it was about, as you see it, a conflict between the government's immigration policy and climate change. Can you just, in one sentence, give the conflict as you see it? Give that conflict.
Well, it's very simple in that, and I mean, I'm not taking it, before I answer the question, if you'll permit me, I'm not taking a side on which should be prioritized, but it's a simple fact to say that every additional human being emits carbon. That is a simple fact to say. It's also a simple fact to say that the Irish government's climate policy is based on reducing the overall level of carbon emissions in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you, as the government plans to do, according to their own words, increase the population of the country by 1 million people by 2040, it becomes infinitely harder to meet your carbon emission targets for that year.
Okay, hold on for a second. That is nonsense on stilts. It doesn't matter where so first of all, I don't think it is the government's target to increase the population. It is the target to cater for an increased population, but that's a different story. But it doesn't, even if it were true, and it's a talking point on the far right, that the government intends to swamp Ireland with 1 million immigrants from somewhere, not stated, but it's always dark hints of where they might be coming from. It matters not at all where those people are, because climate change is an international phenomena, and it makes no difference at all where the carbon is emitted.
Well, with respect, what you're trying to do there is have it both ways. In terms of the reference to a far right talking point, what I'd say is this: the government plans to cater for an extra 1 million people. I will accept that 100%. And can I also say, for the record, I think the far right idea that the government is trying to replace the population with other people is absolute nonsense. So you have that on the record. However, the core of your argument is that somebody emitting carbon in Luxembourg versus somebody emitting carbon here makes no difference. And if somebody from Luxembourg moves to Ireland, it makes no difference because climate change is a global problem. And that is true, but there's a but, William. And the but is that Irish government policy is not to reduce carbon emissions in Luxembourg. It is to hit carbon emissions for the island, or the 26 counties, but I suppose you might as well say the island of Ireland. In other words, we on this island have to emit X amount of carbon by 2030.
But that would be an entirely meaningless thing to do if the way that you achieved that was by curbing population growth or having the people living somewhere else. That would be completely meaningless.
But, well, you might argue that, but you would also have to say that in order to accomplish it, and this is the simple point I'm making, in order to accomplish the carbon targets you're trying to reach, if you increase the population level, you either have to reduce the carbon targets to inflict the same level of pain on every citizen, or you have to keep them at the same level. And if there are more people, that means every citizen has to reduce their individual levels of carbon more. It's a simple mathematical sum.
It's not, John, because first of all, it assumes pain, as you put it. And in fact, the pain, as you refer to it, is adaptation. And one of the things, because heating accounts for 40% of our carbon output, one of the things that needs to be done is building what are called passive homes. That's to say, homes with heating standards that essentially don't need anything to be burnt in order to keep them warm. That basically doesn't inflict pain on anyone other than conservative industries that don't like change.
Well, hold on a second. It does increase costs, for example, because if you mentioned passive homes. So there was a report, and this is a podcast, so I don't have the facts in front of me, but I'm happy for you to check them up afterwards, or you to ask me for it, and I can send on to you.
We'll put a link. We'll put a link in the show notes. Yeah.
There was a report suggesting within the last couple of years that the individual cost of building every new carbon neutral house, or adapting an additional carbon home like my own, adapting an existing home to become a carbon neutral home, was in the region of €25,000 per home. So if you have more people, you have more homes to adopt, so your costs go up. I accept we disagree over the word.
If you have a larger economy, hold on for a second. If you have a larger economy, because the population is larger, that doesn't inflict any greater cost on any individual.
But if you have a larger economy, I mean, you're defeating your own argument there, because if you have a larger economy, you have larger emissions to start.
Not necessarily. You don't have larger emissions per person.
Well, hang on a second. You have a larger economy, you have more emissions, because the single biggest link between emissions and any human activity is economic growth. That is why you have the degrowth movement in place.
Okay. Let's park that for a minute. But I think that truth on this is very important, and there's been an awful lot of essentially spin. And I want to look at one article that you published, and this is in the top paragraph of the article, written by Bruno Pontes, published on your website that you're editing. And it's talking about the hack of the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit emails. And your article says that these emails showed the scientists plotting to manipulate data so as to make the warming theory look credible, to suppress evidence that contradicted the thesis, and to boycott and discipline divergent researchers and journals that published the writings of people who didn't believe in climate change. That is flat out false. That's not an opinion. That's a fact claim. And it is an entirely untrue fact claim. There were 8 major investigations into those hacked emails, including by the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, including by Pennsylvania State University, by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and by the US Department of Commerce. All 8 of those investigations came to the same conclusion, which was that there was no evidence of fraud or scientific misconduct. And this is a talking point on the far right of climate change deniers claiming that these emails showed something which they didn't. And you're reporting as fact this untrue claim.
There are a number of things that you've just said before I get into the meat of the thing, which I'd like to respond to. The first of all is that I take significant exception to the notion that climate change denial, as you put it, skepticism as I would call it, is far right. I think it is held far more widely than that. Secondly, I would say that while you are correct to say that those are Bruno's words, it's factual to say that's what Bruno wrote. It is not factual to say that it was a news piece. It was a comment piece, and that is Bruno's opinion.
No. It's not an opinion. He is making a fact claim. He is saying that the emails showed the scientists plotting to manipulate data. It showed no such thing.
He's saying it is that his opinion is that what the email showed.
No, that's not a fact. No. That's not an opinion claim. That's a fact claim.
With respect, if I could finish without interruption, William, the point is this. First of all, the East Anglia Climate Research Unit emails is a very good example of the kind of thing I was talking about at the very beginning of this podcast, where I mentioned story selection. That happened, I believe, in 2005 or 2006. I can't remember, but I remember it at the time. Mm-hmm. So it's not news now. It happened years ago, but I do remember at the time it wasn't covered in the Irish media at all. The second thing is that there are a couple of things that we can say with absolute fact about those emails that nobody who reads them can dispute. The first is that they do show scientists talking about each other, how to ensure that a paper skeptical of the claims that those scientists were making is not published in a reputable journal. That is an absolute fact. That's what the emails show.
Hold on for a second. It is entirely proper for scientists to endeavor to maintain the integrity of the science. The US Department of Commerce, no friend of the environmental movement, investigated that very thoroughly and came up with a very clear conclusion that there was no scientific misconduct and no fraud.
Well, hang on a second. I mean, because the goalposts always move just a little bit on these, so we have to be a little bit forensic. It would be entirely improper if those scientists were reviewing the material and decided on the basis of ideological objections not to include it, even though it passed scientific rigor. No disagreement with you there. However, the scientists concerned were not in any way involved in reviewing the material. They were talking amongst each other about how to contact those who were. And therefore you cannot say, and with respect to the US Department of Commerce and everything else, and one of the things that we do in the world is we don't take, and one of the things climate change advocates often do is they take decisions by big government on merit that they wouldn't take from big government on merit on any other topic whatsoever. So we say all of a sudden that because no impropriety was found, no formal impropriety was found, that there was nothing at all dodgy about this. Of course there was dodgy behavior about this, which is why people don't want to talk about it and haven't wanted to talk about it for 10 years.
So eight separate major investigations said there was no evidence of fraud, no evidence of misconduct. It's surely at some point you have enough evidence to say that's it.
I don't think it's necessarily about whether or not there was formal misconduct. I think if you read those emails, they can show you much more about the environment in which this is being discussed.
Wait, what? There were tens of thousands of emails. Have you read them all?
I read a significant number of them at the time.
Well, there have been quote mined out of context excerpts published almost ever since on far right, and I will certainly say it, on far right climate change denial websites. That's not an investigation, and reading a few quotes out of tens of thousands of emails isn't a legitimate basis for making a decision for yourself.
We will just have to disagree on whether or not climate change skepticism is far right, given that the former and founding head of
not
Green...
essentially, but it's certainly frequent there.
For your listeners who mightn't be aware, one of the people who's skeptical about climate change is one of the founding fathers of Greenpeace. Who's not, I don't think, a far right individual. I, by the way, myself, I'm not necessarily skeptical, but I think the constant shouting down of those who are is not healthy.
Nobody's shouting down. Then hold on for a second. The proportion of relevant scientists who are skeptical about climate change is significantly less than the proportion of relevant historians who are skeptical about whether the Holocaust happened. It is amongst the relevant scientists, that's to say the scientists who study and publish in that area. To say it is a fringe belief is the very least you can say about it. But I want to move on from that.
Can I address one just point in relation to that? Because you're absolutely correct. The figures are something like 97% of all those in relevant disciplines. Now, the relevant disciplines are often held to include disciplines that one mightn't immediately think are relevant when you look at what they include. And secondly, science is an exact measurement. It's either correct or it's incorrect. And simply because 97% of people think something, that is not by itself proof that they are correct. And also within that 97%, you should be honest and admit that there's a wide divergence of views on whether or not climate change is merely man-made, as many people believe, or whether, on the other extreme, climate change is man-made and it is going to wipe us out within 10 years, as the more extreme people on your side of this particular
argument. John, neither you nor I are scientists who are qualified to comment on this, so I'm going to leave it to the people who actually do. But I want to move on from that, and I want to just have a look at. And you say that I think you've been trying to put some distance between yourself and the far right, but I was looking at one article which is about what's called the PiS, or it's called the Law and Justice Party in Poland. And the headline on your article is How Poland's Pro-Family Patriotic Party Increased Its Vote. And the article is in pretty much the same tone as that headline. It is really adulatory of the PiS. This is a party that has closed down many opposition media outlets. It has had dozens and dozens of journalists in the state TV and radio fired for not sufficiently supporting the party. And when an extradition case of a suspect where Poland was looking to get him extradited back from Ireland to Poland came before the High Court, Justice Aileen Donnelly said this about what PiS was doing to the Polish judiciary. She said, what appears to be the deliberate, calculated and provocative legislative dismantling by Poland of the independence of the judiciary, a key component of the rule of law, was the reason to refuse extradition. That's to say, one EU country, Ireland, is refusing to extradite a suspect to another EU country, Poland, because the country has been firing judges who don't agree with the government sufficiently. That is not a party to be celebrating, but it's pretty much the only foreign political party that your website does celebrate.
If I can put this, let's just talk calmly about it. There are a couple of things to say here. The first is that the article explains how they increased their vote, which I think is a relevant story.
It is an adulatory article.
It's relevant to explain why people in Poland vote for these people. That's absolutely essential. What is their appeal? In terms of the issues that you mentioned, I would note first of all that Poland is a fellow member of the European Union, our family of nations, which is committed to upholding human rights. And were Poland not
and the European Court of Justice affirmed that High Court ruling, saying that such was the undermining by that party of the rule of law in Poland that Ireland was right not to extradite a suspect.
That's the European Court of Justice doing its job, and the judiciary should be independent. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that this is the second time in your piece, and it's perfectly fair for you to challenge me in all this, that you appear to be conflating an opinion expressed by one writer with the editorial views of the website and news reporting. Those things are separate, as they are separate in any other publication. So what I'd say is that the views expressed in that article are certainly not my own. My own view, though, is also not yours, which is that the reasons why political parties gain support in countries and lead them to do things like take on the state-run media and get rid of a bunch of journalists is not hard to imagine when you look at our own country. It is, I would find it very difficult where and for the reassurance of your readers, I never will be, but were I in elected office, I would find it very difficult not to argue for the dismantling of our own state broadcaster, for example.
But that's nothing. Hold on for a second. Let's not wander away from that. That's not what PIS are doing. They're not dismantling the state broadcasting at all, the state broadcaster in Poland at all. What they're doing is they're just firing all the journalists who won't support their party. And they're firing all the judges in from the courts who won't support their party.
And in my view, and for the record, I believe that is completely wrong. However, they are also winning significant amounts of support in Poland. And it is worth noting, it is worth an article explaining why they are as popular as they are, which is why I took the decision to publish that. It is not necessarily, they are not necessarily my own views. I would not vote for them. I am a conservative. I'm not a nationalist. I have never been a nationalist. I never will be a nationalist. But I do believe that when you have a significantly popular political movement, then the case for that political movement needs to be put and explained to people in other countries who might be wondering why on the earth are the Poles voting for these people. Because you often see the coverage in the Irish media, and I'll use a different country as an example, one that people will be perhaps more familiar with, which is the one right across the Atlantic. I remember the front page of the Irish Times the morning after the election in 2016, which ran, I think, 6 separate pieces lamenting in so many words the collapse of American democracy, with no attempt to understand at all why the result that took place had taken place. And
but the difference there is that the Irish Times is a private institution, and if you or I have the means and the talent to set up our own newspaper in the morning, we can do that. This is PIS dismantling the editorial independence of the state broadcaster in Poland and dismantling the independence of the judiciary, which, as Justice Aileen Donnelly said, was a core element of the rule of law. So this is not some individual who's entitled to express their view. What they're doing is they're dismantling the independence of the judiciary and the state broadcaster. That's an entirely separate thing, and it's not analogous to the Irish Times running, biased headlines.
Hold on a second. I'm not comparing the Polish government to the Irish Times. I'm trying to explain. No, I wasn't. And if you think
go
that
ahead,
I was,
go ahead.
What I was doing was I was explaining the context of why I took the decision to publish that article, which was that I think it is important when a movement that people might be questionable about wins support, that people understand the reasons why it did. What is that political party doing that is causing people to vote for it, even though you might believe that its actions are unconscionable?
Yes, but John, hold that thought, because as you phrase it, that's an interesting thing to do. But the answer was essentially in the headline saying how Poland's pro-family patriotic party increased its vote. What's pro-family about firing independent judges? What's patriotic about firing journalists who don't agree with you? What you're doing there is you're focusing on the aspects of this essentially authoritarian party that you like. This is not, it's different entirely in scale, but it's not different in principle from the idiot argument that, Hitler built nice motorways. It is focusing on an entirely irrelevant aspect of an authoritarian government.
Much like President Higgins did the other day when he praised the Cuban leader's commitment to democracy. When
Agreed.
He met him at
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Okay? So you're doing the same thing.
No, hang on a second. What I'm saying is, first of all, it's an honor to be compared to President Higgins, a fine individual who I think all your listeners will appreciate. But what I'd say is this in response to it, because this is a very fair question. Pro-family and patriotic is how they describe themselves. And that, I think, that phraseology is core to understanding their appeal. They believe they argue that they are returning Poland to a place where the family and love of country and a sense of community is at the centre of Polish life.
Yeah, but it's a very limited idea of pro-family and a very limited idea of a sense of community. So, for example, Lech Kaczynski, the mayor of Warsaw, banned gay pride parades, and when asked to discuss the topic, said that he wouldn't meet with perverts.
Despicable language. But hang on a second.
But not what you report.
Hold on a second. The Polish people are voting for these people. Why are they voting for these people? Because those ideas apparently have popularity in that country. And what you're saying is that our coverage essentially, I mean, and this is, I think, where you and I fundamentally disagree about the role of journalism. And I think it's an interesting conversation to have, because I think what you're saying is that journalism reporting on movements of that nature should say to the people reading at home, these people are popular, but some of the stuff that they do is objectively despicable. In our opinion, objectively despicable. And that, therefore, subscribes, in my view, to the progressive view of journalism, which is that journalism is there as a bulwark against movements that we don't like. And that is a legitimate point of view. It is not, however, the view of journalism that I subscribe to, because I think when you go down that road, when you start empowering journalism and you start saying, well, hold on a second, journalism is to make sure that there is never fascism or Nazism ever again. It starts off as a laudable goal, but it tends to end up with everything you don't like becomes Nazism. So I accept 100% that the policies that you describe in Poland are utterly despicable. And in fact, I will undertake right now on this podcast to go and write an article on the website about that myself. But I think it is also legitimate to provide a point of view saying, why is the ordinary Polish person voting for this political movement? And that's well,
I agree with you. I agree with you on the last point. I'm not sure that your article covered that, but since you're saying you'll write another article inspired by me, I feel very proud. I'm delighted, and I look forward to reading that. But I want to move on. And one thing that you mentioned there was this Godwin's law that everybody who you disagree with is Hitler, and this is essentially a logical fallacy of ascribing all negative characteristics to anyone you feel negatively about. And that is essentially straw manning. And I want to just get your opinion on one. And I know that you've been involved with, at least with the individuals involved in the pro-life movement. And I'm wondering, how would you feel if somebody ran a headline, let's say, in the front page of the Irish Times, since you mentioned them, saying the March for Life protesters all paedophiles? And I'm sure you can imagine that would be an entirely illegitimate thing to do. And it's perhaps the lowest form of journalism to, when you can't substantiate a story, to put a question mark at the end of it. And I just want to look at one of your headlines, written by you, by the way. It says, "Are Irish Extinction Rebellion protesters being paid to protest?" What evidence do you have that protesters in Extinction Rebellion in Ireland are being paid to protest?
The fact that it's a global organisation and the protesters in the UK are being paid to protest.
It's entirely untrue, completely untrue. What evidence do you have that protesters in the UK are being paid to protest?
As I understand it, and I don't have the article in front of me, but the evidence is in the article. I mean, it's it was a newspaper report from another newspaper.
Let's slow down. Because you linked to an article, and I do have the article in front of me, in the Mail on Sunday, but the article that you linked to actually did not make that claim. What the article you linked to said was that some of their full-time volunteers were being paid. And I would imagine that every non-governmental organisation, every major pressure group has paid staff. And it's entirely unsurprising that a large protest organisation would have some paid staff working their office or working as organisers. It's entirely unsurprising. Which is the fact that the Mail on Sunday decided to make that a splash headline is up to them. But you then converted it to saying that the protesters were being paid. There's no suggestion that that's true in Ireland, and there was no suggestion in the Mail on Sunday that that was true in the UK. Would you accept that those are two entirely different things, that the activists, the organisers who run the office or who go out and organise local groups, being paid is an entirely different thing to the protesters who come out for protests being paid.
It's a distinction of convenience, I would say.
No,
I mean,
hold on for a second. You said you talked about the Life Institute. Are there any staff there?
There is one full-time member of staff, yes.
Okay. That's a considerably smaller organisation than Extinction Rebellion. And that person is paid.
Yes.
Yes. That's entirely different to suggesting that the quite a few thousand people who came out and marched on the March for Life are paid to come out and march.
That is correct.
What you said in your article entirely falsely was that the protesters were being paid. That was entirely untrue. There was no suggestion of that in the Mail on Sunday article that you linked to.
Well, hang on a second here. There is a difference. I mean, if somebody is sitting in an office and performing administrative work, that is entirely different to somebody who's on the streets and protesting. And
yes, of course.
There's absolutely no doubt. And in fact, if you listen back to the recording, you said it a few minutes ago yourself, that the organisers and stewards and all those people, as you described them.
There's no mention of the stewards. I've got the article in front of me. There's no mention of the stewards. It is referring to full-time activists.
I was referring to what you said a couple of minutes ago. And in fairness, you may not have said the word stewards, but people can listen back. But the full-time people who are on the streets, I mean, these Extinction Rebellion protests, you compare them to the March for Life, and there is one significant difference, which is the March for Life, or indeed the March for Choice, or most protests that we're aware of, happen for one day. Yes. You know, you pick a Sunday, you go out, you have 10, 20, and everyone argues when people are there, and everyone goes home, and the activists feel great, and the opposition spend the day saying it was rubbish and all that nonsense. But the Extinction Rebellion protests are substantially different in that if you look at what's happening in London and Dublin, I'll use Dublin because it's our own country, where you have people occupying Merrion Square for the guts of a week.
Oh, okay, no, you're going way off the topic here because you wrote a headline. Do you know, John, you wrote a headline saying, are Extinction Rebellion protesters being paid to protest? And I asked you, do you have any indication that that's true? And the answer is no. You have no suggestion that that's true.
I'm coming back to the kind of people who are being paid in the UK and how they differ from the case that you are making. And I am saying that you cannot hold a protest for a week or more in the one place. So people who don't have jobs, clearly, who can spend a week in one place without providing them with some remuneration. That is not to say that every individual who is there, somebody who pops in on a Monday is being paid or somebody who pops in on a Thursday is being paid. But people who are there manning the lines Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, those are the people who are being paid, who you are calling organisers and administrators. But
yes, which is exactly the case with Extinction Rebellion in the UK, as reported in the Mail on Sunday.
But in this context, those people are not mere administrators because they are the people manning the protest from Monday to Friday.
No, there's no suggestion of that. There's no suggestion of that in the article that you linked.
The fact is that Extinction Rebellion is an incredibly well-funded organisation with a huge number of staff.
No, it's not. In fact, the Mail on Sunday was very clear on this. It said £200,000 was their total salary bill since their inception. That's say all the pay put together of all of the paid staff members was 200,000. Even if they had only 10 organisers or paid staff, it would be £20,000 sterling each, about €25,000 each. It's a minuscule amount of money.
First of all, I disagree with your characterization of whether it's a minuscule amount or not. And secondly,
hold on. You think that 10 organisers being paid £20,000 sterling each for a year is a huge amount of money?
What I'm saying is that, first of all, there's no evidence that that's an entirely hypothetical figure.
No, it's not. No, that's the figure that was in the Mail on Sunday.
Well, hold on a second. No.
Which you linked.
10 people being paid full-time for a year is an entirely hypothetical amount of money. One of the examples...
No, but the 200,000 is the figure mentioned in the Mail on Sunday.
Exactly. So let's be clear about what we're talking about, which is the 200,000 figure and what you can do with 200,000. And one of the figures mentioned in that article, for example, was that one activist, who I remember was a member of the aristocracy, as I recall, was paid something in the region of 1,500 or 1,600 for a couple of weeks, which is not a huge amount of money, but you can easily afford.
But John, what you are pandering to is the claim, again popular on the far right, that all of the people who show up for a protest are not genuine protesters. You're pandering to the notion that in fact they're just hired people who have no interest in the protest and are only there to collect a paycheck. That's nonsense, isn't it?
I think it is fair to ask if money is being paid.
No, it's not fair to ask
UK.
unless you have some. John, it's about as fair to ask as me. It would be me fair to ask: is everybody on the March for Life a paedophile? Hang on a second. There's a priest. Lots of priests are paedophiles. All these marchers must be paedophiles. And I won't even say that. I'll just say, are all these marchers paedophiles? ? That's complete. That is trash journalism.
I see. I fundamentally disagree. If there's trash journalism, then by all means accuse the Mail of it. But if something is happening in the UK,
of it because you misunderstood. You misunderstood a Mail on Sunday article. In fairness, the Mail on Sunday article was written to invite being misunderstood because they said activists, which is a term that could potentially also cover the protesters. But it was very clear if you read the article rather than the headline, which I suspect you only read the headline, that it is very clear that there's no suggestion that the UK protesters were being paid, and the notion that you can then run a headline saying, are Irish Extinction Rebellion protesters being paid to protest? You haven't a shred of evidence that they are. That's true, isn't it?
William, you just said...
No, question, yes or no. Do you have any evidence at all that the protesters in Ireland are being paid?
Yes.
What is it?
The evidence I have is that they are being paid in the UK.
No, they're not. There's no evidence that they're being paid in the UK.
Hang on a second. You said a minute ago, and I'm quoting your own words back to you 100%. You said there is, in fairness, you may only have read the headline.
Yes.
Now, if you have the article from Gript in front of you, you'll see that the article from the Mail is quoted extensively. So, I mean, you should first of all retract that nonsense because it's patently obvious that I read the piece.
Without reading it, but nevertheless, you're referring to the protests. To the protesters. There is no suggestion in the Mail on Sunday. I'm not going to go around in circles on this, but there is no suggestion in the Mail on Sunday that protesters are being paid. And you are throwing out a question as a straw man. It is what is called jacking off, JAQ, saying, I'm only asking questions. If you're asking a question that contains an accusation of which you have no evidence, I think that's trash journalism. But I'm going to move on.
With respect, I want to make one final point in relation to this because it's important. The reason that I wrote that piece, and people can read it on grip.ie, they can go and read, see what we have been fighting about for the last 10 minutes, is that I believe it is absolutely essential that all movements are held to account. And what that article was actually about, it was commentary on the Irish media saying that the Irish media would not and will not ever approach anyone from Extinction Rebellion Ireland and ask them if the same policies that apply in the UK are being applied to Extinction Rebellion Ireland. I said it simply won't happen.
You're running a news website. Why don't you ask them?
Because we did actually email them. They didn't respond.
Oh, well, but hold on for a second. John, hold on. You say here, if protesters are being paid, that would put a rather different spin on things. And that's entirely true. And you're trying, without evidence, to imply that they're being paid and put a spin on it. But let's move aside from that, because I want to move aside of that. And rather than looking at your ethics, I want to look at an article that you commented on ABC. ABC News Channel is part of the ABC Broadcasting Corporation, was originally one of the three major networks in the United States. I'm not aware that ABC or the ABC News Channel is available in Ireland. I guess I don't have a big enough satellite dish, but you ran a headline saying, will Facebook label ABC as fake news after hoax war footage? And what this referred to was that ABC News ran an incorrect piece of videotape when they were reporting on the Syrian war. There's no evidence that they did it deliberately, and there's no evidence that it spoke to any bias. It was just video images of night firing, and whether that happened in Syria or not, clearly they should not include incorrect war footage, but if you're broadcasting 24 hours a day, sometimes you will make a mistake. But there's no suggestion that the ABC News Channel ran a hoax. They made a mistake. Why would Facebook label ABC as fake news? Because they made one error of fact.
You see, I think we're coming at this one from slightly different places in that you're saying, and I think entirely fairly, because we had a pretty big row over the last topic. So let's try and discuss this one more reasonably and see where we're both coming from on it. I think your position here, and you can tell me if I'm summarizing it unfairly, is that ABC News made an honest mistake for which they should not be punished. Is that fair?
I don't speak to them being punished or not punished at all. What I'm saying is there's no evidence that they made anything other than an honest mistake. And the error that they did make there's nothing in it that tends to push in one direction or another. It's not like they were claiming an event happened when it didn't, or claiming an event was bigger or larger than it was. They were reporting on the conflict in Syria, and they included some videotape that included night firing, so basically explosions in the sky, but that did not happen in Syria. There's no suggestion that there isn't a war in Syria and ABC have faked the entire conflict. It's just that they used the wrong piece of video footage. So I'm saying that the punishment that they should suffer is that they lose a bit of reputation because they need to retract.
I hear where you're coming from, and I don't.
But to suggest that a single error makes them liable to being labelled as fake news, that's nonsense.
You see, I agree with you. That I believe is the standard that should apply. I don't disagree with anything that you have said there, but I think what you're missing is that the story isn't actually about ABC News. The story is about Facebook. The story is about, do Facebook apply their own rules equally to everybody? And the answer is that they clearly do not. In that ABC News will get leeway because, in fairness, you know, it is perfectly understandable how you can make that mistake. It's very easy when you're running a busy newsroom to put in the wrong B-roll or put in B-roll or roll or anything like that. And they will not be punished or held to account by Facebook for a simple error. But, and this is where the but comes in, Facebook do not apply that standard all of the time.
Can you give me an example where for a simple error that did not betray a bias in one direction or another, they held someone responsible?
I can't off the top of my head.
Well, can I make an example of where they might do that, where somebody puts in straw man questions accusing people of being paid to protest when they're not?
Well, you see, this is it. This is a very good example, because while Facebook haven't taken action against us, nor should they, for that piece, because you disagree with it. And by the way, you're entirely within your right.
I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm neither agreeing nor disagreeing with it. I'm pointing out that you're wrong in fact.
It is your view that we are wrong in fact, and that is a perfectly legitimate view for you to take. But it is a view. It is your view that we are wrong in fact. And my point is that when you start giving people powers to impose their views, you should expect that those views are imposed consistently across the board.
Absolutely.
ABC News, you've just said that our piece was wrong in fact.
Yes.
Well, I accept 100% that ABC News did not intend to make a mistake. I accept 100% that their inaccuracy had no particular meaningful effect on public discourse. But it is also true to say that they were wrong in fact.
Yes.
They presented factually inaccurate information to the public.
Yeah, I guess no, but John, there's a second part of it, because that error, error did not speak to any bias or any apologia in any particular direction. When we look at your website, and you just put in climate in the search, you see that what you get in the search results is basically a carnival of straw man and other logical fallacies. So we see there 5 reasons why no one actually takes climate emergency seriously. Jordan Peterson to women: ignore climate alarmism and enter motherhood joyfully. Another article: listen up, chumps. RTE is planning to lecture you on climate change this autumn. Another one: climate change is the world's most expensive religion. So clearly, the false headline that you put in there is part of a broader movement on the website to question the science on that.
Hang on a second, because this is very important. Go through, and if you've read them all, we could discuss each one of them individually.
Yes.
There is huge amounts of evidence out there that a significant number of people do not take climate change seriously.
Yes, and they get interviewed and featured on your website, and the great bulk of the people who are qualified to talk about it don't.
Hang on a second. There's lots of people who are qualified to talk about climate change.
Okay, hold on for a second, Jim. One of the people who talks online most about climate change is a fake lord, a guy who goes around pretending that he's a member of the House of Lords when he's actually not, a guy called Lord Monckton. You interview him, give him a very soft interview on your video piece, and the headline is, climate change is the world's most expensive religion. That is.
I think we will have to, first of all, have a little refresher course for you on the British Constitution, because Lord Monckton, while not a member of the House of Lords since the abolition of hereditary peerages by Tony Blair in 1999, does remain a peer of the realm.
Lord Monckton, as he styles himself, is not and never was a member of the House of Lords, and there is a page on the House of Lords website which is a reproduction of a letter to him personally asking him to desist from calling himself a member or a former member of the House of Lords.
He has a hereditary peerage, which is he is entitled to the term Lord. That is a prefix. It is like referring to the Duke of Sussex as the Duke of Sussex. He also is not a member of the House of Lords.
But Lord Monckton claims to be a member of the House of Lords and is not.
I'm not. Look, if that's true, that's true. I don't see the point in us having an argument about it. However, the main argument that we're having is about our coverage and the difference between what we're doing and what ABC News is doing. And what I would say is that we are presenting views and facts from an alternative point of view, or a less well covered but very well, very widely held view of climate change to the one that you clearly have, William. I
don't have any view. I'm not qualified to have a view.
Leave the listeners to judge that for themselves. With respect, I clearly have a view. I'm
not qualified. I'm not qualified to fly a plane. But if you're sitting beside me after your third beer, telling me that the pilot doesn't know how to fly, I'll go up to the cockpit and take over. I know who I'm going to wrestle to the ground.
Do you know that's legitimate? I think amongst my very few qualifications, I mightn't be the worst person to bet on in that situation. But we'll say no more. The point that I'm trying to make, if we can come back to the core of the conversation, because I think it's important that we do, is that if you go through those headlines which we ran there, I don't think any of them merits any kind of interference from, action by, sanction of from Facebook. They are at best, even if I accept the most malignant, malevolent, negative view of what we're doing, and I don't, but even if I did, they represent a strand of political opinion in our society. They represent views that are held by many people. They are arguments that I think deserve to be debated as we are debating them now. And I don't think there's any scope whatsoever for somebody in Facebook or any other social media platform to say, no, we shall not cover them. And one of the decisions I deplore, for example, and one of the things I believe I wrote the article saying, listen up, chumps, RTE is planning to lecture you on climate change, is that I think what RTE is doing on that topic is utterly deplorable, in that they have said openly, number one, we will only cover this from the point of view that it is real and it's an absolute emergency. We must take action immediately. Number two, we are actually going to spend our money as a broadcaster on hosting.
Pause there. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. But pause on that. Would you therefore say that RTE should give equal weight to people who accept the science and people who don't?
I don't think it's about accepting the science or not accepting the science.
No, there's a broad consensus of scientific opinion on one side, and on the other, there isn't. Are you suggesting RTE should give them equal weight?
You're going to have to let me answer this question in my own way.
Here's it. I'll do you a deal. I'll do a deal, John. Answer it your own way, but start with a yes or a no.
The question was, should they give an equal amount of time or shouldn't they?
Should they give them an equal, the scientific consensus and the people who don't believe in that scientific consensus equal weight?
No. And this is important. No, they shouldn't. And the word equal is very important here, by the way.
Okay, they should give them due weight, I would argue.
I would say that climate change is not, however you might be trying to characterize it in this conversation, and you're trying valiantly, it is not simply a scientific discussion. It is absolutely not. The science informs the discussion 100%, but above all else, more than anything else, because ultimately, if 97% of the scientists, including the 10% who say it's an absolutely immediately world-threatening emergency, are accurate, then it is how we respond to that is a political question. And what I am saying simply is that the political opinions in how we respond to the scientists should be given equal weight, not the scientific opinions necessarily. I don't think it is particularly good viewing, if nothing else, to have two fellas on arguing about a hockey stick graph. I don't think that informs the public in any way, shape or form. But we should have have genuine policy debates about the way forward. For example...
Sure, yeah, I actually totally agree. Well, I totally agree with you on that. I think that the science doesn't tell us what the policy is. The policy is a soft, human, values-based decision. The science is not. The problem is one side of that sees that, given the science, it's very hard to push their political opinion, and rather than pushing their political opinion in a difficult situation, they try to say, no, the science is wrong.
But I disagree with you about what's difficult here, because I actually think you have that one a little bit backwards. The problem is actually that the advocates.
Oh yeah, it goes both ways. I agree with that. And there are people on the left who say, and Naomi Wolf is probably one of the most prominent, who say that dealing with the climate crisis should be intimately linked with establishing socialist government in every country in the world. You're correct that happens, and I think that is equally fallacious. But I want to read to you an extract from one column by a conservative that was written about 7 years ago. It said, "We are seen as skeptics of climate change when in reality we're skeptics of the policies that liberals want us to adopt and tackle it. What is a healthy skepticism of the idea that government programs can change the climate has been allowed to fester into an idea that, as a group, we hate science." That was quite a perceptive thing to write about 7 years ago, wasn't it?
Yes, and when I wrote it, I was saying, I stand over.
You wrote that, and I can imagine you say, and I think I agree, it's quite perceptive. But then 7 years later, you're publishing articles, 5 reasons why no one actually takes climate emergency seriously. Listen up, chumps. RTE want to lecture you on climate change.
Yeah.
Climate change is the world's most expensive religion. So that does seem to come across as we hate science, but I'm going to pause that, and I'm going to go, finally, we've gone on very long, and I'm not going to continue on that. I'm not going to continue on that because I want to move on to one other one, and again, quoting you yourself.
No, hang on a second, because I think it's very important, and you're telling me all for an hour now what good journalism is, and good journalism is putting something to somebody and letting them respond. So if you'd permit me just 90 seconds to respond to that. It is absolutely true that is how conservatism is largely perceived. Even to this day, it is largely perceived as so. For example, one of the things about me, if I can lay out my own views on the matter, is that I resolutely believe that we have to take massive amounts of action to protect the seas, the oceans, the animals, the plants, all the rest of it. Where I have some skepticism, where I think a lot of people have skepticism, is the idea that it is possible via policy to change the makeup of the atmosphere in such a way as to change the long-term temperature of the planet. I think that is an entirely untested proposition. It is certainly true to say that the proposition has been tested, that the atmosphere may be having an impact on the temperature. What is an entirely scientifically untested proposition is the idea that it is possible through political policy, all of which, by the way, seems to involve, as Naomi Wolf says, the adaptation of socialist government worldwide, to change the atmosphere in such a way as to reverse that. And so while I, absolutely stand over the quote I gave 7 years ago, how people are seen, and I was talking about how conservatives are seen, does not necessarily mean that they are always wrong.
One other thing I will go to is a separate quotation from you from the 31st of March last year on Twitter. You said that you were pouring scorn on somebody saying that the repeal the eighth side would win big in Dublin, and you said, okay, tell you what, if Dublin Central is 75% yes on the day, I will never take a political job again.
And I haven't.
The figure was not 75%, in the end it was 76%.
And I'll clear that up. I haven't, and it is not my intention to do so. And I say that, by the way.
Well, I'm not planning to hold you to that. But my point is, my point is that what you were saying, particularly 7 years ago, is considerably more conciliatory. Is there a possibility that you're looking at a gap in the market because you've seen various hard right-wing people who have absolutely no loyalty to reality or facts or scientific study promote YouTube channels and so forth, and that you're trying to get in on the market?
I want to talk personally for a moment to answer that question, because I think it's an important question, because there's an element to which the answer to that is yes, and an element to which the answer is no. First of all, I think there is a gap in the market. I think that one of the things that has happened, particularly since the abortion referendum, although it was possibly happening before that, is that an awful lot of people, and when I say an awful lot, I'm not talking about 50% of the public, I'm not talking about 20% of the public, I'm talking about maybe 5 to 8% of the public, which is still, by the way, an awful lot. It's about 4 times the number of votes for the Social Democrats, who are taken seriously enough, are getting increasingly disillusioned with the country that we live in and the political system that we live in, and that is leading them down the path of attending meetings of and supporting individuals who I won't name on this channel, but everyone will know who I'm talking about, who have, first of all, complete detachment from reality, and secondly, genuinely fascist views. And I think that is very, very dangerous. And I think there is a tendency sometimes in progressive circles to kind of go, look at the loser troglodyte pro-lifers wandering off to talk to those people, and we'll dismiss them and laugh at them and they'll go away. And blah, blah. The problem is that if you look at the rest of the world and you look at the rest of Europe, there is every possibility that will happen, but there's also every possibility that 5% will suddenly find somebody who doesn't believe that 5G gives you cancer, or doesn't believe that, the airplanes are putting chemicals to control your brains into the atmosphere, but who is articulate and able to turn that 5 to 8% into 13 or 15% and hold a government to ransom. That is a real possibility. And I think there is a gap in the market to talk to that segment of the population in a way that, first of all, makes them feel we're being represented, our views are being represented, but also says to them, and you've discussed a lot of articles we've written on Gript on this piece, as is your absolute right. But for example, I wrote a piece at the weekend lambasting 2 individuals who I'm referring to by name for their behaviour in one of the towns with a direct provision centre, and suggesting that a better way to deal with this might be to provide some economic incentives to those towns. I think it's important that there are people who are able to address that chunk of the political market in a way that defuses some of the more extremist voices rather than simply amplifies them. And to that extent, yes, I'm appealing or trying to appeal to a gap in the market, and I don't deny it, and nor would anyone else who writes for us. But the second point in terms of a gap in the market, and I want to be absolutely clear about this because it relates to the question you asked about my tweet about not taking another political job again, is that I'm absolutely 100% not seeking a gap in the market for myself. I have a very nice, quiet life down here in Tipperary. This will surprise people, but I genuinely do not. I'm shy. I don't like people particularly much, believe it or not. I'm not very. I really hated that pro-life campaign, the referendum campaign, as I think anyone who is honest on either side of it will tell you that they hated it because it was so nasty. And hands up, I contributed to some of that nastiness. So did others on both sides. It was a genuinely. It wasn't. The whole thing, even had we won, it would have been a shattering experience, because I think in campaigns like that, you see the very worst of people. And oftentimes I think it's important that we try to focus on seeing the best in each other, even when we disagree. So what Gript is, it's an honest attempt to express the political views of a chunk of the population that simply do not feel represented right now. So I hope that's an answer. It's as honest an answer I can give you. I recognize 100% that some of the things that you've said to me in this conversation, particularly the one around the political party in Poland, where I think publishing that piece without publishing something else more newsworthy on the story and was probably an error. But I would plead to you that 2 months in, we're bound to make the odd error. But I do think that there are ways that we can improve. But I also think, and I'd say this to your listeners, what we're doing is in some ways, I think, very necessary for the long-term political health of the country. I don't think there's going to be a Conservative majority tomorrow or in 20 years, but there could be a very significant, you've used the term a lot, far-right movement in that time frame if those people are not provided with a more conservative outlet for their thinking that rejects those kind of policies.
John McGurk, editor of Gript, thank you very much for talking to me.
No problem.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
I linked my sources, including one supplied by John about the cost of passive homes, in the show notes that you can find on the website, but there was one thing that we discussed that I have to comment on. On the Gript website, there's a video interview under the headline "Pay More Taxes to Change the Weather, the World's Most Expensive Religion," with a man called Christopher Monckton. Gript presents him as an expert in climate change, and he makes various claims about himself. His first claim is that he's a member of the House of Lords. This is a straightforward lie, and he's been telling it for years. He even wrote to US senators making the claim and got himself invited to talk to a congressional committee in the US, with him saying that he was bringing fraternal greetings from the Mother of Parliaments, although he got short shrift when he appeared before the committee.
I noticed you brought fraternal greetings from the Mother of Parliaments to Congress, to our athletic democracy. When did you start serving in the House of Lords?
Sir, I have never sat or voted in the House of Lords, as you have probably been informed.
Thank you. So basically, I want to understand. Thank you. You've answered my question.
Yes.
You come here, you call yourself a lord to try to convince the world to ignore something that threatens our grandkids, and you're not even a lord. Now, don't let me finish my question.
Monckton is not and never was a member of the House of Lords or any other parliament. The closest he came was when he ran in 2011 for the Scottish Parliament as a UKIP candidate. He got 1% of the vote. His false claims to be a member of the House of Lords annoyed the clerk of the UK Parliament enough to publish a letter to him which said, "My predecessor wrote to you twice in 2010 asking that you cease claiming to be a member of the House of Lords either directly or by implication. It has been drawn to my attention that you continue to make such claims." And the letter ended, "I am publishing this letter on the parliamentary website so that anybody who wishes to check whether you are a member of the House of Lords can view this official confirmation that you are not." This was not the first fantastic claim that Monckton made. He was quoted in 2010 announcing he has discovered a single treatment that cures multiple sclerosis, the flu, the common cold, and AIDS, which is lucky because in the 1990s he advocated for all HIV-positive people to be locked up in concentration camps. He also subscribes to a whole host of other crazy right-wing conspiracy theories, such as Barack Obama's birth certificate. Monckton has also claimed to be a Nobel Prize winner. I've checked the website of the Nobel Academy, which lists all the winners. He's not mentioned. Monckton has also repeatedly claimed variously that he was Margaret Thatcher's climate change advisor, scientific advisor, or her chief scientific advisor. But John Gummer, Thatcher's environment minister, has said that the idea that Monckton had held any such position is, quote, laughable. In fact, Thatcher wrote a doorstopper of a book, The Downing Street Years, detailing her time as Prime Minister. Her science advisor is listed as George Guy's. Monckton is not mentioned. And it's laughable because, if anything, Thatcher would have been far better qualified to advise Monckton on science than the other way round. She had a science degree from Oxford University. Monckton has no scientific qualifications whatsoever. But that didn't stop the Gript website inviting on Monckton to sneer at Greta Thunberg and lecture in his plummy accent, and it didn't stop their presenter fawning over Lord Christopher. If ever you wanted an example of a silly little Irishman obsequiously doffing his cap to a silly little Englishman, this interview is it.
The scientists themselves will now be telling them, sorry, we cocked it up. We got it wrong. We screwed up.
But, Lord Christopher, at the same time, and I accept your point that the science will ultimately undermine their conclusions, is it not the case that whenever people like Greta Thunberg can stand up in front of the world's media and say we face a mass extinction and make claims
John McGurk
like that,
asked me after our interview to include his last statement that he made unedited, and I've done this. He explained to me that his intention with the website is to provide a rational, conservative news medium, and that this was important so as not to let right-wing crazies out there be the only voices that challenge what he sees as a liberal consensus. That's not necessarily a bad thing to do, but if his ambition is to provide thought leadership as a counterweight to those crazies, he has to, first of all, differentiate himself from the crazies. For as long as he's publishing adulatory articles about anti-Semitic, homophobic parties like PiS in Poland, or giving fawning interviews to crackpot con men, that distinction isn't so clear. As I said, sources are on the website, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow John McGurk at John_McGurk, and Gript at Gript Media. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Also, thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate them. That allows me to devote more time to finding interesting guests and doing research. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.